Hello everyone. Welcome back to our philosophy series, where we explore timeless concepts in a modern context. Today we're diving into one of the most intriguing philosophies to emerge from ancient India, Charvaka. In particular, we're going to explore Charvaka's unique theory of knowledge, focusing on why sense perception, or pratyaksha, is considered by Charvaka philosophers as the only reliable source of knowledge. We'll also discuss why they reject other commonly accepted sources of knowledge like inference, testimony, and more. By the end, you'll understand why Charvaka's perspective on knowledge is so radically different and how it even questions deeply held religious and spiritual beliefs. Let's get started. So, who were the Charvakas, and why is their theory of knowledge so important? Charvaka was an ancient school of Indian philosophy, sometimes referred to as Lokayata, which means the philosophy of the people or worldly philosophy. The Charvakas were known for their radical materialism and skepticism, especially when it came to anything beyond what we can directly experience. For Charvaka philosophers, the only source of reliable knowledge is sense perception, or pratyaksha. This means that if we cannot see, hear, touch, taste, or smell something, we have no way of knowing it with certainty. According to Charvaka, anything that goes beyond direct sensory experience, such as inference, religious testimony, or abstract reasoning, is prone to error or deception. In other words, Charvaka takes a what you see is what you get approach to reality. They argue that if we limit ourselves to what we can actually experience with our senses, we avoid the risk of being misled by assumptions or beliefs that might not hold up under scrutiny. Let's break down pratyaksha, or sense perception, a bit more. Charvaka philosophers argue that sense perception is the only knowledge that is immediate and self-evident. When you see an apple, you don't need someone else to tell you it exists. You see it, you can touch it, you can even taste it. Your senses give you direct evidence that the apple is real. Charvaka scholars believe that our senses are generally reliable and direct. They do not require interpretation, or an additional step to confirm the truth. This makes sense perception straightforward and dependable in Charvaka's view. Now, you might wonder, what about when our senses deceive us? Well, Charvaka philosophers acknowledge that our senses are not perfect. However, they argue that sense perception is still the least flawed source of knowledge we have. Other forms of knowledge, like inference and testimony, rely on assumptions and can lead us further away from the truth, in Charvaka's view. Let's talk about why Charvaka rejects inference or anumana. In Indian philosophy, inference is a common method of gaining knowledge by drawing conclusions from observations. For example, if you see smoke rising from a mountain, you might infer that there's a fire, even if you can't see the fire directly. But the Charvakas would argue that this process of inference is unreliable. Why? Because it depends on assumptions. In the case of the smoke, you're assuming that smoke always means fire. What if, they ask, there's another cause for the smoke that you're not aware of? What if it's dust or steam? Since inference relies on these kinds of assumptions, Charvaka argues that it's risky to consider it a valid source of knowledge. Charvaka's critique of inference isn't limited to everyday examples. They apply this skepticism to all metaphysical claims, especially religious beliefs. For instance, if someone argues that the existence of the universe implies the existence of a divine creator, Charvaka would dismiss this as an unreliable inference. In their view, the jump from the universe exists to a God created the universe is a leap without sufficient sensory evidence. Let's move on to testimony or shabda. In many Indian philosophies, testimony, particularly religious or scriptural testimony, is considered a valid way to gain knowledge. Scriptures, religious teachers, or historical texts often claim to provide insights into things we cannot experience directly, such as the nature of the soul, or the existence of the afterlife. But for Charvaka, testimony is highly unreliable because it relies on the authority or credibility of others. Charvaka philosophers argue that just because something is written in a scripture or spoken by a respected figure doesn't mean it's true. People, they argue, are fallible, and their claims about unseen or unexperienced realities cannot be trusted without direct sensory evidence. For example, if someone tells you that there's a beautiful mountain far away that you've never seen, Charvaka would say you can't truly know it exists until you've seen it yourself. This rejection of testimony extends to religious teachings, especially doctrines about things like karma, reincarnation, and the afterlife. Charvaka argues that since these things cannot be directly observed or sensed, we cannot accept them as true knowledge. Beyond inference and testimony, Charvaka also rejects other forms of reasoning, such as analogy and comparison, which are accepted by various Indian philosophical schools. Charvaka philosophers argue that these forms of reasoning are simply extensions of inference and face the same problems. They rely on assumptions and are prone to error. For example, if we say, just as a pot has a maker, the world must have a creator, Charvaka would argue that this is a flawed analogy. The existence of pots made by humans doesn't necessarily mean the universe was made in the same way. Charvaka holds that unless we have direct, sensory evidence of the universe being created, we shouldn't assume it has a creator. Charvaka's emphasis on sense perception, as the only reliable knowledge source, had significant implications for religion and spirituality. Since they believed that only sensory evidence is trustworthy, they rejected any belief that could not be verified by direct experience. This led them to reject common religious beliefs in the soul, karma, reincarnation, and an afterlife. In Charvaka's view, these religious ideas were simply unprovable speculations. If no one has seen or touched a soul, Charvaka asks, how can we be sure it exists? If no one has directly experienced the process of reincarnation, how can we accept it as true? By holding to their strict requirement for sensory evidence, Charvaka set themselves apart from nearly every other philosophical tradition of their time. Let's consider a few examples to bring this approach to life. Imagine you're offered two pieces of food, one that looks fresh and delicious, and another that's unrecognizable and unpleasant in appearance. Without tasting both, you can use your sense of sight to infer that the fresh-looking one might be better. According to Charvaka, relying on your senses is the safest bet here. They'd argue that rather than relying on someone else's claims about the taste or any mystical properties of food, your best guide is your direct, sensory experience. Similarly, if someone claims there's a divine spirit in a sacred place, Charvaka would challenge that belief, asking, can you see it? Can you touch it? If not, they would argue that it's baseless to accept the claim as knowledge. To wrap up, Charvaka's theory of knowledge stands as a unique, materialistic approach in Indian philosophy. While most other schools in Indian thought embrace multiple sources of knowledge, like inference, testimony, and scripture, Charvaka insists on direct sensory experience as the only valid way to know anything. This strict reliance on sense perception not only set them apart but also led them to challenge religious beliefs, abstract reasoning, and any knowledge claim lacking direct evidence. So, Charvaka's emphasis on what you see is what you get forms the foundation of their philosophy, making them a fascinating subject in the study of ancient thought. They're an early example of philosophical skepticism and materialism, ideas that would later appear in Western philosophy as well. If you enjoyed this video, be sure to like, share, subscribe, and hit the bell icon to stay updated. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.